USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. A look at this weekend in college hockey and a review of the top news of the week.
Welcome to Weekend Review for Monday, January 4th, 2021. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside my guest co-host, Dan Rubin. Dan, welcome aboard.
Hey, thanks for having me. Pleasure as always riding side saddle here, and I'm just excited to talk some New Year college hockey. New Year, new hockey.
New Year, new hockey. Weird year, weird hockey. But one team that is off to a terrific start, if you call 9 games a start, Minnesota. The Golden Gophers had their first comeback win against Arizona State. There's one later today as we record this. Number 1 in the poll again. Bob Motzko's team is on fire.
Yeah, and I think, Ed, that when you look at Minnesota, the way that the Gophers are playing, they're just playing out of their mind. And in those 9 games, they have they've barely been touched. Defensively, they're preventing goals from coming in. They've only had a couple games where they've allowed more than 1 goal. Offensively, they're averaging 3 to 4 goals per game with only 1 game under 3 goals. So this is a team that knows how to just attack teams and prevent the attack coming back the other way. They trailed. That first goal that Arizona State scored over the weekend was the first time Minnesota had trailed this entire year, and it happened in the first period. They came out in the second period and scored 3 goals. So this is a team that is playing with purpose. They have one of the best, if not the best, college hockey players in Sampo Ranta. I think that this is a team that when you look at, you say, well, it's only a small sample size at 9 games for what we've been able to see, but they're loaded. They're good. They're so good. And I think that they live up to the expectations and then some. And
Jack LaFontaine has been terrific in that.
Oh, yeah. He's been phenomenal. He made another, I think it was 27 saves in the win over the Sun Devils and outplayed Evan DeBrouwer, who didn't play poorly. But you make 9 saves in the third period. You make 9 saves in the second period. And again, only give up the 1 goal. That's a good day at the office for Jack LaFontaine, who is probably one of the better goalies that anybody will see from any team this year.
At this point, you'd have to think he is a Richter Award finalist. But you mentioned Arizona State. I think that other than the first weekend against Michigan, where the Wolverines kind of blew them out, Arizona State has been extremely competitive and right in the midst of this. And when you consider that every game is a road game for them, the Sun Devils are doing very well. Greg Powers should be proud of this team. I want to speculate a little bit here. Is this maybe a good audition for becoming the 8th member, an associate member of the Big Ten for hockey?
Well, it should. It should on the ice. Like you mentioned, after that first weekend, they really haven't played poorly. They beat up Wisconsin pretty good around Thanksgiving time, and then in December, they haven't won many games since they beat Notre Dame at the beginning of December. But all those games that went to overtime, the Penn State games, 3-2, 5-4, they tie out against Ohio State. They're under 500, but this is a good Arizona State team. And when you look at Arizona State and you kind of get a feel for what they bring to the table, they logically have always fit into the Big Ten, in my opinion. They're getting a good audition this year. If they can continue to play well into the second half, I think that it bears a very, very long look at bringing them in to even out the numbers. And if you can make the travel work, because all those teams would have to go west and go out to the desert, I don't foresee Arizona State playing every year, every game on the road, not with that facility they're building out there. But I think that this is a team that has really set a template for power schools that are looking at hockey or debating hockey. And I know we've talked about that so many times over, but the time could start to be right. And I think if it's not, then there has to be a good reason that league's going to put forward, because this program is starting to make a really good case for membership.
I think the profile of Arizona State, when matched up with the Power 5 programs that make up the Big Ten, really matches up better than, say, the NCHC, which is a lot of kind of like-minded schools. It just seems to be a natural fit, and certainly the budgets must be there for travel down to Arizona State. But I want to switch now to the NCHC. You mentioned them, or I mentioned them. One of us did. I heard it mentioned somewhere. Denver split with Colorado College on the weekend. Denver came out very much below 500 out of the NCHC pod. And Jimmy and I, on Thursday, when we were looking forward to the weekend's games, Jim said, look, they really need to win all the games they should on paper. Well, paper said they should win both games last weekend and then the next two coming up with Colorado College. But the Tigers came away with a win on the first night of the series and ended up splitting the weekend. Does Denver have to start worrying a little bit?
I think they do. This week when I filled out my poll and I was listing out the top 20 teams, I didn't have Denver in my top 20. And I realized that when you look at the NCHC and you look at that whole entire league as a top to bottom, it's the best league in college hockey. And I think the national championships speak for themselves. But when you look at the individual teams and you look at some of the results in there, I just couldn't really justify giving them a spot in my poll personally. They lost a game 4-3 to a team that didn't have 20 shots on goal. You have to look within the numbers and see some of those performances, and see some of the performances in there. But those were games that you would have expected Denver to go out and maybe pull out some wins, pull out some bigger wins. There's only so much you can look at a team and say, well, conference only, best conference in the country, 4-7-1, and outweigh and throw the record away because they have to be pretty good. They play in the NCHC. So unfortunately, they're kind of at a loss because of what happened in that opening bubble. But at the same time, I can't, when you look around the country and you look at the way some of these other teams are playing relative to their competition, I just could not see Denver in my top 20. And for that reason, they do have to start worrying because I know there are probably going to be people out there that think like me.
Also in the NCHC, a weekend split between Minnesota Duluth and St. Cloud State. Minnesota Duluth is who we thought they were, one of the top teams, first, second best team in that conference. St. Cloud, Brett Larson's team had a little bit of a down year last year.
Yeah, and St. Cloud, I thought coming back after that loss in overtime was a big pickup for them. They're a good team, and they lost a real back and forth heartbreaker on Saturday. Come out on Sunday and win a 3-1 hockey game. That's really a 1-goal hockey game with a power play goal, a couple of power play goals in there. So you take some of the power plays off the board, and it's a shutout. I mean, that 1 goal for Duluth came in the third period with the extra guy out on the ice. So I personally really like the way St. Cloud has rebounded. I go back to the way they played on Saturday, which was just a phenomenal college hockey game. That game left to right was probably the best college hockey game of the year so far. And that's maybe last year they don't play that way in that game. So I think that it's an encouraging sign. I had them 7th in my poll, right next to Duluth. The two teams I would put side by side, and I'd love to see them meet up as often as humanly possible, which I guess in a good way, we at least have 2 more meetups this weekend, 2 more at the end of the season. I could go for another 4 games between those two teams.
Sounds like the ECAC, they're underway finally on New Year's Eve, got their first game in. Everybody's playing everybody else 6 times, so they're going to really get to be chummy. Quinnipiac seems to be the cream of that small crop. Clarkson may be a step behind where I thought they would be. But who I'm really impressed with are the other 2 teams in that league, St. Lawrence and Colgate. Both of them seem to be improved from last year, especially St. Lawrence.
Oh, a quick shout out to St. Lawrence in their second year under Brett Brecky and good friend of the program for us from Atlantic Hockey, Ben Murphy, the assistant coach who was at Bentley for a number of years. And I knew that those guys were going to bring energy. Luckily, getting St. Lawrence back on the ice this year was a huge step. And when you look at what they accomplished against Quinnipiac this weekend, it was no short of just a masterful performance, a 4-2 win. Yes, they lose the shootout on the New Year's Eve day, but they come back on the road in a home and home that when you think about the travel involved with that, where Quinnipiac has to go out to the North Country on New Year's Eve, and then they come back 3-4 days later and play the back end of a home and home in Connecticut. That's a heck of a trip. And they did it in 1 on the road against a very good Quinnipiac team that 4 goals over the last 4 minutes in that game between the two teams, an extra attacker goal. Quinnipiac pulls the goalie, power play. I mean, that's great news for St. Lawrence, and it's going to be tough to gauge ECAC teams against one another this year. I think that's just a fact of an observation of fact, but that's a good start for them, and I think there's going to be a lot of respect thrown about in that league with how often these teams are going to play each other.
You make a good point about the travel for Quinnipiac. Obviously, between St. Lawrence and Clarkson, you're talking 10 minutes down the state highway. Even going from Hamilton, where Colgate is, up north is only about a 3-hour trip. But that's quite a haul from eastern Connecticut all the way up there. I wonder if that'll factor in a little bit. That I guess remains to be seen. But I think this is going to be a very competitive 4 teams, and whoever comes out of that into the tournament, however that gets selected, is going to be tested and maybe a surprise.
Well, and the fun part about that is that Quinnipiac is very clearly the cream of that league right now, and that's right now. And obviously they play Clarkson 3 days in a row, then they play Clarkson 3 days in a row at the end of the month on the road, and they have a number of road games back and forth. But you would have said Quinnipiac and Clarkson are at the top of the league, but Clarkson, I mean, I had Quinnipiac substantially ahead of Clarkson. I've been kind of fading Clarkson a little bit the last couple of weeks in my poll votes, because I think that the way that the season has broken down for them has just been difficult. But it'll be really fun at the end if those are your 2 top teams to say Quinnipiac might be blistering on a pace and maybe sliding a little bit at the end with the travel, and Clarkson maybe picks up the pace at the end and they meet somewhere in the middle. That's going to be really exciting to watch.
We've got 3 more leagues to cover, and that's coming up after this short break. You're listening to Weekend Review.
This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from US College Hockey Online.
This is the Weekend Review podcast from USCHO.com. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Dan Rubin, filling in for Jim Connolly. In the WCHA, everybody's been noticing Bowling Green. They continue to climb up the polls. They are hot, but so is Minnesota State. They came off a weekend of 2 shutouts against Northern Michigan. How about those 2 teams and where they fit in the overall scheme?
Well, hot hockey take coming. I actually had Bowling Green ahead of Minnesota State, which I think is the first time I've ever put a team from the WCHA in the WCHA ahead of Minnesota State in the 7 years or so that I've been creeping around in the college hockey voting ranks. And the reason why I did that isn't necessarily a knock against Minnesota State. I think it's a compliment to Bowling Green, which is 11-1. They won their first 2 conference games this week, quote unquote conference games against Ferris State. They've been on a roll. They've just looked so good, and they're just crushing teams. And they outscore Ferris this weekend 10-3. I would put them a hair ahead of Minnesota State, even though Minnesota State shut out Northern Michigan. I think that's more of one of those to be expected out of a team that's just playing well. We always seem to see Minnesota State win 25, 26 games a year. And obviously that number is going to have to adjust this year with the abbreviated schedule. But I'm really looking forward to how these 2 teams are going to jockey. They're not going to see each other for a month or so, and a lot can happen in between then. But I think those 2 teams have clearly established themselves. And if you're looking at your poll as kind of a litmus test of where teams are right now, a team that's 11-1, and I don't care what league they're coming out of. If you're 11-1, you're just as good as a team that's maybe 5-1-1, and you have a case to those North Dakotas, those Boston colleges, and even a hair behind Minnesota.
You mentioned Boston College. Let's turn to Hockey East right now. Trying to figure out that league is a little bit of a jumble because the amount of games different teams have played varies pretty widely. Everybody was expecting this to be a big year for BC, and certainly they're terrific. And when they get Spencer Knight back and get rolling again, it's going to be a great season for the Eagles. But here comes UMass I want to say out of nowhere, but not really out of nowhere. Greg Carvel's built a great program there, but right now they're at 8-3-1. They had 3 wins last week. How about the Minutemen?
Well, the funny thing, I never know how to take Hockey East this year, and I didn't know it at the beginning when they were playing a lot of league games as non-league games, hoping that they'd turn into potentially league games if needed, and then the league decided to make everything count, which I totally understand and totally respect and agree with. When you look at that, at that point, I believe had rocketed BC in percentage of points or total points or whatever the number was. Far and ahead, and BC's been on a tear, and Spencer Knight's doing what he's doing in the World Juniors. So I don't want to belabor just and carve BC back down to the rest of the league. But UMass is kind of creeping in that next spot, in that second spot, and they've been beating teams fairly steadily. The 2 wins over Northeastern over the weekend were good. Northeastern didn't let them off the hook, which is a nice thing to see out of the Huskies when you look at a 1-goal game, a 2-goal game in there, 5 goals allowed. I mean, UMass had to go out and earn that. And it's really 2 1-goal games with the extra empty net goal, I should point out. Before that, if you're looking at games against Vermont, UConn, UNH, UMass should be in that class that's up ahead when you think about a Frozen Four team from 2 years ago potentially reloading as of right now. Now, where this kind of falls in the rest of the season is going to be kind of intriguing, because if UMass keeps up this pace, does BC, having had a month off or however long it's been, do they kind of run into a little bit of rink rust given once they get their guys back from the World Juniors? Do they give them a rest? How does that work? It's way too early to tell, especially with percentage of points and how the standings are going to shake down. But I think watching these 2 teams move against one another and kind of a tectonic shift each week is going to be really fun once the Eagles get back.
Let's look at Atlantic hockey. A couple of teams I want to mention, although it's a small sample size. Canisius seems to be defying initial projections. They were picked tied 10th with Mercyhurst. They swept the Lakers over the weekend. They've also beaten Robert Morris. They're at 3-1. Robert Morris, 6-1 in the league, 8-3 overall. As I noted as we were preparing here, Bobby Moe has some big Mo going into things. I know you had Robert Morris pretty high on your preseason projections. Those 2 teams, Canisius, Robert Morris.
I'll start with Robert Morris because I think I referred to them in this week's Monday 10 as a machine, and I used some real robotic terms for them. I was like prototype, template. I mean, because they're Atlantic hockey's machine. I mean, they're good every year, and I expected them to dominate, especially with the pod-based scheduling and the lack of travel. Like they were just. There's very few teams that are designed to win under every single circumstance like Robert Morris is, and I think that's why Derek Schooley has put together so many good teams through the last 7 years. I mean, they're just good every year. They're just good every year. That's just one thing to expect. They go out and they win 3 games last week. They beat Niagara pretty handily on New Year's Eve, and then they sweep RIT. I know you had a chance to watch that series, and that was just a good team and solid, and I can't really describe them any other way. Canisius, on the other hand, is really interesting because Canisius split with Robert Morris at the beginning of the year and then had 30-something days off because they had to pause due to COVID. They come back and they get back from the break. They go through, making sure the film from those first 2 games didn't just dissipate into the ether. They come out, they miss a handful of games, and then they come out and sweep Mercyhurst, who I know is punching above its weight to start the season, and they fixed a lot of their issues that had plagued them last year. But Canisius didn't really have a slate to work with, and they come out and beat a good Mercyhurst team. They're going to get tested really in the next couple of days when they take 3 games against RIT. When they play that, then they play Robert Morris, then they have to play RIT and Niagara again. But the way they survive the next maybe 2 to 3 weeks in that Western pod is really going to go a long way for us to determine just how good Canisius can be. And if this weekend was any indication, it's pretty good.
Well, one thing I do want to mention about Robert Morris, their Sunday game against RIT, they were handily outshot in that game 37-19, including 20 shots on goal by RIT in the second period. The standout for me for Robert Morris right now is freshman goaltender Noah West, who has established himself as the guy. .938 save percentage through 7 games, 5-2 record for the Colonials. So that's a big part of the early success for that team. Let's turn to a couple other items. COVID continues to be an issue. Just before we started recording, we found out that, again, this weekend, Omaha and North Dakota have games postponed, this time into the middle of February. But Bentley and Holy Cross and AIC at Long Island University and a few others here and there keep cropping up. Boy, it's just, I guess it's going to be what we'll have to deal with all the way through, just these unknown pop-ups of COVID. But are there risks that things may not be able to complete the season, or are we just kind of at this plateau where we have to deal with it?
Yes. Yes. I never want to pontificate on if we're doing the right thing and playing, or if it's going to happen, if it's not going to happen. I never want to be the one to say this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. Like I always say, there are people a whole lot with pay grades a whole lot higher than mine who make those decisions in every league. I will say this. Every team understands and understands what is out there. And I think we all understand what's out there in the world in general, and in a COVID world where we're going through what are really unprecedented times, nationally unprecedented times in the sports world, et cetera. That said, I think that these pauses, we kind of expected them as a hockey community to happen. We're trying to, as an entire hockey community, I don't even mean this from an Atlantic hockey standpoint, trying to weather the storm as best we can. And that's why you're seeing leagues do things like percentage points instead of percentage of points played, as opposed to just standard standings, because the schedules might get unbalanced. I think we're going to see, I would hold my breath a little bit and cross my fingers and do my rain dances or whatever it takes to keep the schedule flowing. I think the majority of teams are able to play games. I don't know how this is going to go the rest of the year, what the tournament's going to look like, but I will say this, these teams are going to have to play a lot of games in a short amount of time. And I think, one of the things that when I actually talked to Trevor Large this week from Canisius, he said it's going to feel a lot like a pro style schedule. We're playing games Wednesdays and Fridays, and it's going to be a little bit different. And the teams that can weather that will probably be the teams that rise to the top of their respective leagues. And there's a whole bunch of factors and nuances in between that. I'm optimistic. I think the season's going to continue, and I think we're going to be okay. I just, every time one of these things comes up, or you see a cancellation, your first inclination is, oh, please don't let it be COVID, let it be travel, let it be a rink, let it be something. It's always just to make sure everyone's safe first, and then we can go from there, because the hockey will come, and I do believe we will be continuing the season and finishing the season. What it looks like, I just don't have any idea.
Well, when I snuck across the border from New York to Pennsylvania over the weekend, I also had an opportunity to talk to some folks who were part of the committee putting things together for the Frozen Four scheduled for Pittsburgh in April. Robert Morris hosts school for that, and they did it once before and did a terrific job with it. They are still planning as if this is going to happen, as if there's going to be a Frozen Four. However, already planning not to have fan events like they normally have. But that really brings up a bigger question. And sticking his toe in the water a week ago, or a little over a week ago, was NCHC Commissioner Josh Fenton talked about using historical data to allocate positions in the postseason. He acknowledged there are a couple issues with that. You got to make sure you take heed of particularly Arizona State, but even Long Island University as independents. I think as I was reflecting on this, I think maybe his proposal on that probably was to counter some of the thought that had come out before that every league should get their regular season champion and the postseason champion, or however they want to do it, 2 per league. And I can see why that wouldn't be fair either. Where I am on this, and I'd like to get your take on it, I'm at the position where they should be doing the quote-unquote eye test and look at teams, look at how good they are, but factor all these things in. Consider that the NCHC typically gets 4, and you've had 3 in Hockey East or 4, and 3 in the Big Ten, maybe 2. That should play into it, but trying to put any kind of hard and fast rules on it risks leaving somebody out. And I know there's no more smoke in the smoke-filled rooms, but it's going to come down to that. And I think they need to leave some flexibility to hammer it out, but all these different things should be considered.
So my take is probably going to be much more unique because obviously I work with a league that typically only gets one team in and et cetera. But I will say that as having gone through football season and having gone through the way that the football rankings shook down with the college football playoff and some of the arguments around the fact that the same four teams got in. It was one of those where, if not this year, how do you when teams opted out and then some teams only played 5 or 6 games and the conference only scheduling, the big thing that came up to me was that this provided a great opportunity for some teams that you don't usually see to get into the rankings and then to stay there. And because they got in there, and once they were inside the rankings, they got new eyeballs. This week, 2 Atlantic hockey teams are ranked. I don't remember the last time 2 Atlantic hockey teams were nationally ranked. It might have been last year. It might have been 5 years ago. It's just not something that you usually look at and go, oh, that's early in the year to have that happen. And granted, they're down 19-20 in the polls, but if you look at that league and those 2 teams get in, there's going to be more eyeballs against AIC and Robert Morris. Now, as more people watch them, maybe more people look at it and say, yeah, that ranking doesn't make any sense and drop them out. Or maybe they watch them or they see the results and say, hey, these 2 teams are pretty good. And they bump them up over teams that are 500 from other leagues. So that's when it leads into the eye test. From what I've noticed and from what I have seen throughout college sports is simply that there is no mathematical way to do it this year, and coefficients or pairwise rankings. It obviously doesn't happen. And trying to use historical data, I think, does not to break entirely, does do a disservice to leagues that maybe would pass an eye test a little bit more. Separately, it also, the eye test, Atlantic hockey teams playing Atlantic hockey teams might be doing a disservice to the NCHC, which typically gets 4 or 5 teams in. So there is no perfect way. I would like to agree with kind of the system that Paula and Jimmy had floated out about regular season and first half or regular season and tournament champions and getting everybody in some capacity. But I do think if you're going to be in the smoke-filled room, I think there should be equal representation in that room. And I think that the people who are in that room should be willing to concede and not just hold their turf for their league. So what I mean by that is, if I'm in that room, for example, which I'm clearly not, but if I were in that room, I would say, hey, I would love to advocate for Atlantic hockey teams, but is it realistic to try and get 2 or 3 teams in from our league? No. At the same time, it's not fair to say, well, all these other leagues get all these teams based on historic when we have 2 teams in Atlantic hockey that are good. So that's my perspective. It's very long. It's very convoluted. I don't think there's going to be a perfect answer, but I would like to think that as a community, college hockey always does a really good job of banding together to do the right thing. And whatever happens is something that I think the majority of us will easily be able to get behind.
Lastly, we've got just a minute or 2 here to wrap up. World Juniors Championship has been a blast to watch. The USA team is really like a college hockey all-star team. Semifinals tonight. As we record this, have you enjoyed what you've gotten to see of this so far?
Very much so. I think that it's a blast to watch the annual NCAA hockey American team against and try to get into the Canadian Major Junior matchup. And I haven't watched it admittedly as much as I think I wanted to, but it's been great to watch for me. Have a little bit of civic pride in the American team with a bunch of college hockey kids, and I'd love to see what happens in the semifinals and in the championship. There's going to be some great games going on, and I'm personally proud of what these college hockey teams have done in terms of generating players. And I will say this: what the United States did with its shutout streak, 200-something minutes. I think it were 3 consecutive games. That's just an amazing accomplishment considering what USA Hockey does at the World Juniors. And I think that this is a real testament to college hockey. I think the folks at USA Hockey should be very proud. I think the people at College Hockey Inc. should be very proud. I think all of us should be very proud. And I'm very excited to see what happens, hopefully another U.S.-Canada gold medal game.
One thing that I think has been kind of interesting in the whole thing is that when the USA squad has played its best, It's when they've played Nate Lehman style hockey, workmanlike. It's sort of like Providence hockey on steroids. They have then been the best on ice that they've been throughout the tournament.
I've spent so much time in the Frozen Fours that I've worked around Nate Lehman and spending as much time in a pre-COVID land down in Rhode Island that I got to be honest. I love his style. I always have. He's also been a great interview for me personally when I've been able to do it at Frozen Fours. And he is and you know what? My only fear is that the United States and Team USA hockey would somehow keep him would keep him at Providence because of my allegiances in Hockey East. If they keep him at Providence and then keep him at going to the World Juniors and they're playing this well, then that means no other teams are going to win the Hockey East championship at some point. It's going to be like playing Duke in basketball.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. You know, the funny thing with Nate Lehman, you mentioned about talking with him, he is so direct and so to the point when you talk to him. It's really a pleasure. There's no couching things in euphemism. He's very direct and to the point.
Oh, he's the best. I have never had a bad interaction with him. I can honestly say that. And I know that and I say this even as a guy who's American, like I'm proud that he's the coach of my national team at the World Juniors. So it's nice to be rooting for the Friars and instead of just covering them or again, rooting for players that you normally see and you might have allegiances to other schools. If you can't get behind that, then I feel bad because it's a really special thing to watch players from different backgrounds and different teams unite under one style like that.
And it's good to see Ted Donato get to do some hockey coaching this season, and it looks like he's having a blast.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine what it's like for him. And I'm never going to criticize what Harvard's opt out or the other ECAC schools for opting out. I'm never going to criticize teams and schools for doing that, but you know, they're hockey guys. They live to be in hockey rinks. And another thing, just it's the last quote, I guess, was what Trevor Large said to me this week. Not to tease my Atlantic hockey column too much, but he said, you know, we're hockey players. It's what we do. Once you're behind the bench and you're out there with your team, it feels right. It feels normal. And for Coach Donato, I can only imagine what that's like to have that glimpse at the World Juniors. This is a guy who lost his season last year during the quarterfinals. I believe Harvard was one of the first teams to opt out back in March. And here we are almost a year later and he hasn't coached a hockey game. So I can only imagine what that feels like. And again, not to get into was it the right idea? Was it the wrong idea? But just for him personally, I'm sure that's a great feeling. And you got to feel happy for a guy like that. Well,
we'll leave it at that. Dan Rubin, thanks for filling in for Jim Connolly. This has been Weekend Review. We'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Weekend Review Podcast, a production of US College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.